All right, Shabbos, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's daf. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Menachim Benjamin and Elys Wohl from Eretz Yisrael, the tiny Eretz Yisrael, in honor of dedicating all the Sora and Sara this month in honor of Moishe Abramson and Jeremy Lasson, who enable all of those outside of our physical Bais Midrash to be able to partake of our Torah. To thank Jack Bennett for dedicating all the Sora and Sara this month in memory of Sergeant Nicholai Rappaport of the Givati Brigade, who died in a Hezbullah ambush in southern Lebanon on February 7th, 1998. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Lara Franks, in the zechus of refuah sheleima for Chaya Mira Bas Sora and Sara Bas Elisheva. And to thank our Daf Yomi week sponsors, Yanky Aliza Statman, in the zechus of refuah sheleima for Chaya Rivka Bas Nechama. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of our cholim, Emeretz Hashem, should have it complete refuah together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, and all of the Nechama should have an Aliyah, the families in Nechama. But with that, let us begin. We have a really exciting and incredible daf ahead of us today. A lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. A lot to do. Today's daf is Ayin Ches 78. We are picking up Emeretz Hashem on the bottom of Ayin Zayin Amud Beis 77b, and we are picking up actually with the story Hahu Gavra, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 lines up from the bottom. So let's remember again, yesterday we were introduced to the concept of kinyan chotzer. The idea that ultimately, again, not only can a woman receive her get in her hand, but she actually has the ability to receive her get in her property as well. We are established ultimately that it has to be a chotzer mishtameres. It has to be a type of chotzer ultimately that is guarded. Guarded means that you can put something in there. Yeah? Put something in there safely, and so if I see Moishe coming up, I feel like a chastised student. Like, what did I do? Yeah, okay. So we learned that it has to be a chatzim mishtameres l'daita. We also learned that. Well, okay. So let's go back. We're going to learn a lot of new things today, Meretz Hashem as well. So the Gemara says as follows. So how gavra the there was a guy who threw a get to his wife. Havakaima b'chatzer. So right, she was standing in a chatzar. He threw her a get. Okay, so far so good. Azul gita nafla b'pisla. It's an interesting case. The get itself fell on a piece of wood. Pisla is a piece of wood. Okay, Rashi points out over here. Pisla agabe chaticha seitz. I'm Rabbi Yosef. Okay, so now what's going on? Rabbi Yosef says chazinon. Let's examine the situation. Now say, by the way, there's musar in everything. Let's say. What is the word chazinon? Chazinon means let's look. Let's say chazinon is one of the greatest Musa words in the entire Shas. Chazinon teaches us that before you pass judgment and before you decide what something is or who something is, stop, pause, and look. Let's say, how often in life do we rush to judgment? How often in life do we size people up because you see them, they say something, and boom, I've got you pegged for who you are. Something happens in life, terrible, or wonderful. Sometimes I will say the best thing in life is to be a chazinon yid. It could be a bumper sticker. I'm a chazinon yid. Everyone knows what I'm talking about. But I just to be the kind of person who stops, examines, understands what it is that's happening, and then do that before you pass judgment on others, before you pass situational judgment as well. So chazina, let's analyze. So let's take a look at this piece of wood. If the piece of wood is 4 amos by 4 amos, then that is a reshus of its own. I would say that would effectively mean then that the get has landed in a different domain than the one the woman is situated in. Ve'ilo. Now, if the piece of wood is not arba amos, then ultimately, again, it's all part of one rishus. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, hold up. But maya skinon. I would say, by the way, this is even a bigger moser. Sometimes, even after chazinon, you still don't have the right outlook on the situation. Right? If Yosef thinks I've got it all squared away, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yosef, what are you talking about? Maya skinon. Ilema b'chatzar dida. If she's standing in her own chatzar, ki havi dalar amos my havi. Then I don't care. What does it matter if there's a piece of wood is dalar amos, not dalar amos? If it's her chatzar, I will say, then what? Everything inside that chatzar is hers as well. What does it matter where the get is landing? Ela b'chatzar didei. Rather, it must be she's standing in his chatzar. If she's standing in his chatzar, kilo havi amar abbas my havi. Understand? If it's his chatzar anyway, then what? None of this works. Here we go. The ushla makom. Interesting. What's the case? The case over here is it's his chatzar. What did he do? He lent her space. Leased her space. And therefore, the Gemara tells us, and that would work, by the way, if you were to lease her space, and then you were to throw a get into that space, ultimately she would be megureshes. What's the issue over here? The Gemara says, chad makom mushli inshi, shim makom mushli inshi. So the way it works with lending is that if you're lending space, it's common for a person to lend space to another, but in that act, it's usually only one domain that's being lent. Two domains are not lent. So in this case, what's interesting that's happening over here is husband is lending the wife space, a makom, an area. In that area, there's a piece of wood. Essentially what the Gemara is saying is like this: if the piece of wood itself represents a separate and distinct domain, that would not be covered under the lease to the wife. That would be a separate domain. So if the get lands there, she's not megureshes. Interesting. For lo amran, furthermore, again, when did we say this? Ela delo gavoa asara. So we're saying that the piece of wood is 4 amos. Piece of wood being 4 amos represents its own rishos. So the Gemara says, so by the way, it's not just dalar amos. Others will say there are different ways for an area to be considered a separate domain. One of it is that it spans an area of dalar amos. Other possibility is height. If it has a height of 10 tfachim, even if it's not dalar amos, it's also its own rishos. Furthermore, for Amon Ela de Leslie Shem Levi, top of 78, Aval Isle Shem Levi, Afagav Lo Gava Asara, the Afagav Lo Haviarba. Furthermore, I will say, this is all assuming also that it doesn't have its own name. In other words, we'll say Shem Levi, look at Rashi, Tap Rashi and Ayin Ches, says, Kulu Pisla Mikri, V'i Havu Lahai Shem La'atzmo, Havu Lechashav Lo Batal. We'll say, let's say everyone calls that piece of wood, that wood, that's Frank's log. Everyone knows that's Frank's log, right? It's been there for the last 200 years, Frank's log. When something has its own name, by definition it has a chashivos, it has an importance, and it's not bottled to the area around it. So essentially, I will say, just as an aside, there are essentially 3 different ways in which this piece of wood, and it doesn't have to just be a piece of wood, it could be a rock, it could be anything else, could be considered a separate domain, even though it's situated in someone's rishos. Either A, it has an area of dalar amos, B, it has a height of 10 tfachim, or C, it has neither of the previous 2, but halacha l'maaseh, it has its own name. Having a name, a distinct name, gives it an identity. So therefore, again, if Reuven is divorcing Rachel, and he's giving Rachel a piece of land, on a chatzar, in which to go ahead and get divorced to receive her get, and in the chatzar happens to be this piece of wood, right? And the piece of wood is either dalar amos, 10 tefachim high, or has its own name, its own identity. If the get were to fall on that piece of wood, she would not be divorced, because it's falling effectively in a separate rishos. Fascinating. So remember the Mishnah said, even if he is with her in bed, ultimately again throws her the get, it doesn't work, gives her the get. Amarava, lo shana b'mita shalo. That's only if they're in his bed. Aval b'mita shalo migureshes. If they're in her bed, and he gives her the get, ultimately again she's migureshes. That supports this. Rabbi Eliezer Omer b'mito shalo in migureshes, b'mito shalo migureshes. Right? Ultimately, again, we learned that Allah l'maisa, if they're in his bed, not divorced, her bed, they are divorced. We'll say, what's the logic? Her bed is like her chatzar, right? Her bed is her rishos. Over mita shalom migureshes. 1 second. If she's in her bed and she gets the get, she receives the get, she's migureshes. What about the fact the Gemara says, Kelev shalokeach b'rishos mocherhu? We'll say, this is actually interesting. This is going to come up twice today. We'll say, Kelev shalokeach b'rishos mocher means like this. If let's say you walk into a store, right? And you have a utensil. You are the buyer, you have a utensil. You put that kli down. So there's an interesting discussion about whether or not the utensils of a purchaser have the ability to acquire something when they are situated in the domain of the seller. Right? And you can see this could come up all of the time, right? I walk into Ruvain's store, I put my bag down. I buy something, right? Or Ruvain wants to give me something, he puts it in my bag. But my bag is situated on his property, in his rishus. So does my bag, my kli, have the ability to acquire something when situated in his domain? This is called kelav shalokeach, the utensils of the purchaser, birshus mocher, situated in the domain of the seller. So the Gemara says, and the Gemara says machlokes as to whether or not it works. Here's the problem. Even if the woman's bed is her own, let's say it's her chater, it's her own rishus. Let's say, where is it situated? In the husband's home. The pashtus in the husband's home. So, is this not a case of kelav shalokeach birshus mocher? To which the Gemara says, Shamas Mina, obviously learn from here, kelav shalokeach birshus mocher kana lokeach. So I must say that the Gemara is teaching me that the utensils of a purchaser have the ability to acquire even when situated in the domain of the seller. That's why if he gives her the get while they're in her bed, halacha l'maisa, it'll work. To which the Gemara says, no, lo tzricha tegavoa asara. Then we'll say, what's the case? The case is where it's a high bed. The bed is not flush on the ground, right? The bed is 10 tefachim off the ground. Oh, okay. So also we just learned before, what does 10 tefachim represent? What does 10 tefachim do? 10 tefachim is a domain of its own. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, that will work to go ahead and be a separate rishus. V'ha'ika makom kare, right? So we'll say, but 1 second, a bed doesn't float in the air, right? In other words, a bed has legs. What about the fact that the legs of the bed are situated in the husband's domain, so which the Gemara says, nobody cares about the space that the legs take up. In other words, the legs themselves will say ultimately only take up a relatively small amount of space. They will say, what about the fact, the Sotos discusses this, Rashi also discusses this, what about the fact, actually we'll see this on Amud Beis, sorry, but I'll just tell it to you now, what about the fact that the bed itself still sits on top of an area, to which the Gemara answers, since it's gavoa asara, the area underneath the bed is usable as well. So because it's usable, again, a husband doesn't care about the area that the legs take up. Okay, incredible. So the Gemara says if he throws the get into her lap or into her basket. So it says, remember again, Rashi pointed out in the Mishnah, kolsa is a basket, a little basket in which a woman would keep needle thread. It's a purse. So the Gemara says, why does this work? Kelav shalokeach birshus mocheru. That's exactly what we said before. We say, now this is talking more about kalsa. So imagine, we'll say, here's the case. So Rachel has a purse. Her purse is sitting on the ground of her husband's house. What does husband do? What does Reuben do? He throws the get into her purse. So the Mishnah says it works. But 1 second, this is a case of kelav shalokeach, right? Utensils of the purchaser situated in the domain of the seller. And I will say it's a machlokes. It's a machlokes as to whether or not the utensils of the quote-unquote purchaser have the ability to acquire when situated in the domain of the seller. From here, it appears that it works. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, kigon shaisa kolsa teluya ba. No. What's the case? The case it says where her basket was hanging from her, so it wasn't sitting on the ground. Rabbi Lakish Amar Kshura Afapi She'ina Tluya. Reish Lakish says the truth is, it's tied to her even if it's not hanging. They will say, now the chiddush of that is, that's what? It could be the basket is on the ground, right? But since it's tied to her, therefore halacha l'maisa is considered, it's not a case of kelav shalokeach b'shus mocher. Rav Adabar Ava Amar kigon shaisa kalsa munachas la ben yirakosel. So Rav Adabar Ava says, what's the case? The case says, where you can imagine she's sitting on the ground, she's sitting on the floor, and her basket is between her legs. So if she's sitting right cross-legged, and her basket is right between her legs. So the Gemara says, Rav Mishar Shebar Edimi Amar kigon shahaya baila mocher kalsos. Rav Dina Bar said her husband was a basket salesman. So because he's a basket salesman, therefore what? he's not makbid about the area that her basket is situated on, because he's got baskets everywhere anyway. Rabbi Yochanan Amar makom cheka kanoila, makom kalsa kanoila. So Rabbi Yochanan says, I will say in general, the area that her lap takes up and the area that her basket takes up, these are areas that people convey to one another just on a daily basis. Amar Rava my time Rabbi Yochanan, lefi she'in adam makbid lo makom cheka v'lo makom kalsa. But say in general, when someone is in your domain, you give them space. Right? You give them space. You give them the space in which they're sitting on, right? You give them the space to put down a bag. So there's not a hakpada, right? The husband is not makbid on that. And therefore, again, he's okay with the space her bag takes up. He's okay with the space that her body takes up, that her lap takes up. And essentially, effectively, he conveys the usage of that space to her. And therefore, if he throws the get onto her lap, it's in her domain. He throws the get into her basket, it's in her domain. Taina B'Hachir that supports this. Zarkula l'soche kalasoch kalsa l'soch kol davar shehuki kalsa harezu migurashas. Also, the Brisa supports this. Halacha l'maisa, again, husband throws the get into her lap, or throws the get into her basket, or to anything like her basket, she is migurashas. I says the Gemara kol davar shike kalsa lasuyemai. What does that come to include when it says anything like her basket? So the Gemara says lasuye taska da aklu batamri. But to include literally the pouch from which she eats dates, a little date pouch. So cute, right? A little date pouch, right? So ultimately, again, that also is not makbid. So what the Gemara is introducing us to is the following. So essentially, what we begin to see over here is, okay, there's the concept of yad, which is a husband is placing a get directly in his wife's hand. Fine. There's a concept of chatzar, which is a husband is placing a get or throwing a get that into his wife's domain. Then I will say there's a third category. Third category is she's in his domain, she's in his property, but there's an assumption that people convey use of property, of their own property, to others, in what we'll call in the context of activities of daily living. So someone walks into your home, right? Essentially what you're giving them is the area upon which they're sitting. What the Gemara is calling over here, the area of their lap. You're also giving them an area to put down their bag, right? So in this case over here, the assumption is the husband is conveying to his wife usage over these areas, and therefore halacha l'maisa, if he throws the get into her lap, that's her rishus. He throws the get into her basket, that's her rishus. And I will say, this is not a case of kelav shalokeach b'shus mocher. This is not a case of the utensils of a purchaser in the domain of a buyer, because in that case I will say, the domain of a seller, because in that case there may not be a conveyance of usage. Here, there's an assumed conveyance of usage of these areas. Incredible. Good, I will say, that brings us to the Mishnah. Mishnah Ayin Chesam with Aleph 78a, third wide line down. Amrullah, Kinsi Shtachov Zeh, Osho. Osho, listen to this. Reuven's divorcing Rachel. But for whatever the reason, Reuven doesn't have the nerve to tell Rachel that he's divorcing her. So what does he do? He tells her, do me a favor, take this, loan document. Take this loan document. I will say, and then what happens? It turns out it's a get. Oh, now this is an interesting case which we'll have to define. Or I will say, if you could imagine, he has a document kind of like tucked into the back of his cloak, and she takes it out. Korah, she reads it, Vaharihu Gita, and it turns out, surprise, it's her get, right? It's her get. Now, I will say, in case number one, he's misrepresenting. He's actively misrepresenting. He's telling her, take this document, it's a loan document, right? So case number two is, it sounds like he just has it on his person, and she's taking it from him. Both of these cases, she opens it up, it's a get. Ultimately, again, it's not a get until he says to her, this is your get. Okay? Let's say, so what happens? He puts it in her hand and she's asleep. Some people bring their wife breakfast in bed, right? Other people, right, bring a get, right? Let's say, so now what happens? So he brings her a get, she's sleeping. he puts the get in her hand when she's sleeping. She wakes up, Ni'ura Kora, she reads it, Vaharihu Gita, and it turns out it's her get. Eino get, at Shiomer la hagiteich. Ultimately, again, I will say it's not her get until he says to her, this is your get. And I will say, this last case is interesting over here because in this case, there is a direct nesina, there is a direct giving. It appears, I will say, that what the Mishnah is introducing me to is the concept that it's not even enough just a direct giving, there has to be like a declarative statement that this is your get. All right, let's analyze. So, ki amar lo hagiteich my havi, right, my havi, havatli giteich mi al gabe karka. I will say, the Gemara over here is specifically focusing on case number 2. What was case number 2 in the Mishnah? Reuven has the get tucked into, let's say, the back of his cloak. What happens? Rachel comes along, she takes it, she reads it, it's her get. So the Mishnah said it's not enough until he says, it's not valid until he says, Hagitech, this is your get. To which the Gemara says, whoa, one second. Even if he says this is your get, it still shouldn't be effective. Why? Let's say he didn't give her the get. What happened? What happened in this case? She took it. Let's say, remember again, get 101. A husband has to give a get to his wife. Here in this case, she's taking it of her own volition. Why should it work? Let's say if a husband puts the get down on the table, on the ground, and he says, take your get, that doesn't work. It has to be a direct act of giving from husband to wife. Did I skip? I'm sorry. Fine. So what I say that what's the case? The case must be ultimately again that it was. Rashi says over shalafto shayatachov bein chaguro lemasnav v'shalafto bisham. It was stuck. I will say like between his belt, or right between his belt and his pants, or between his pants and his body. It was stuck like into his pants, and she took it from there. To which the Gemara says, "Shalafto nami haba ina benasam biyada." I say, I don't care exactly if it's stuck in his pants or it's stuck in his cloak. If she's taking it and he's not giving it to her, then Lamai said that is a fundamental problem with the get. To which the Gemara said, "Lo tzricha the arik lechartze v'shalafte." This is interesting. What happens? It's if you can imagine for a moment. Imagine the get is stuck in his belt, right by his pants. And what does he do? He moves his hips towards her, right? Right? And like that, I will say, so the Maisa, he's bringing the get closer to her. So the fact that he's bringing the get closer to her, the Gemara understands, that's called the Nesina. I will say, what's the definition of giving a get? Giving a get essentially means, the Gemara understands, is any act of directed motion, moving the get closer to the woman, to the wife, that's called Nesina. So again, if it's just stuck in his belt and she takes it, that's not good. But if it's stuck in his belt and he moves his hips closer to her, then Lamais again, that's called Nesina. Even though both of what's happening, she's taking the get out, right? But since he's moving the get towards her, that's called Nesina. Incredible. The Gemara says, "Oh, sheshafto." Good. Tainam Yachir Bais that supports this. Kinsi shtar chovzeh. If he says to her, "Take this document, this loan document," "Oh, sheshalafto me'achorav," or the get was behind him and she took it. Karaso, she reads it v'hariu git, and it turns out it's a get. Eno get ad sheyomer la hagitech divrei Rebbe. Rabbi Shmuel Silber the olam eno get ad sheyitlena himenu v'yachsar v'yitnena la v'yomer la hagitech. So let's say, listen to this. Rabbi Shimon Elazar says no. In all of these cases, it's not going to be a get until when? Until he takes it back from her and re-gives it to her. Right? Rabbi Shimon Elazar holds all of these acts of giving are not directed acts of giving. You have to take it back and give it back to her. What happens if he put the get in her hand and she was sleeping? Ni'ura, she wakes up, v'kora, and she reads it, Bahari Hugita, and it turns out it's her get. Eino get at sheyomer la ha giteich divrei Rebbe. Ultimately, it will not be her get until he says to her ha giteich. Rabbi Shmuel Elazar, that's Rabbi. Shmuel Elazar omer ad sheyitlena himenu v'yachsar v'yitnena la v'yomer la ha giteich. So Rabbi say it's interesting. So Rabbi Shmuel Elazar, so Rabbi say this is a brisa that mirrors the Mishnah a little bit, but not fully. keep on having this position. It seems to be our Mishnah reflects the view of Rebbe, that really in all of these cases where the woman, now we define, so also we can go through this, right? Case number one is where she took it thinking it was a loan document, it turns out it was a get. Case number two is he moved his hips towards her, right, and she took it. Case number three is she was sleeping, he put it in her hand when she was sleeping, she wakes up and she sees it's a get. Our Mishnah seem to indicate that really all you need in all three of these cases is a declarative statement of hagiteich. This is your get. The Brisa introduces us to the case of Rabbi Shmuel Silber, who says that no, in all of these cases, you got to take the get back again and give it back to her. To which the Gemara said, I will say now, the Brisa itself quotes two different cases, right? The kinsi shtarchov zeh or shalafto me'achorav, or the sleeping case. And both cases had this machlokes, Rabbi and Shimon Elazar. To which the Gemara said, why didn't he both cases? Tzricha di'i itmar bahach kamaisa. Had it just mentioned the first case in the Brisa, Bahika Amar Rabbi Mishum debas egrushihu. Perhaps in that case, Rabbi says, in the case where he moves his hips towards her, she takes the get, right? Rabbi says, all you need to do is say hagiteich. Why? Because she's in a state of being divorced. In other words, she's capable of being divorced. But in the case where he puts the get in her hand and she's sleeping, the lav bas igrushehu, says she is not in the mental state of being divorced. In other words, also we're going to talk about this more. The problem of putting a get in the hand of a sleeping woman is when a person is sleeping, I will say they don't have das. They don't have das. That's the assumption. So Allah Chalamais again, since in the case where he puts the get in her hand and she's sleeping, she doesn't have das. Perhaps Rebbe would agree with Rabbi Shmuel Silber that halacha l'maisa, you have to take the get back and re-give it when she's awake. Ve'i itmar baha, and if we would have just said the second case, Rabbi Shmuel Silber only holds this in the second case where she's sleeping, that you have to take it back and give it again. Maybe in case number one, he agrees with Rebbe, and therefore tzricha. Therefore, we'll say halacha l'maisa. Ultimately, again, both cases are needed. Amar Rava. So we'll say Rava says as follows. Fine. Good. Kasav laget v'nasna biyad avda yashin u'mishamarto hare zeget. Near eino get dahavi leichatza mishtamer shalola daita. So we'll say another interesting case over here. So watch this. Just try to see. Fine. So we'll say, listen to this. So now, another case. So Reuben's divorcing Rachel. Rachel has an Eved Kinani. Right? She has her own Eved Kinani. So what happens? Now imagine if, let's say now, the husband wants to place the get in the hand of the Eved Kinani. Now we'll say, why would such a case work? Eved Kinani effectively is like what? Karka. So in other words, an Eved is like a chatzar. So placing a get in the hand of an Eved should be like placing the get in her chatzar. To which the Gemara qualifies this and says as follows. If the Eved is sleeping and the woman, the wife, is right there, harez a get, then the get works because that's called the chatzar mishtameres. That's called the guarded chatzar. Neir ain't no get. However, if the Eved is awake, it's not a get. Why? Because you will say it's interesting. Even though an Eved is like karka, you can't call, I was going to say a woke Eved, but that doesn't sound right. Right? You can't call, right? You can't call an Eved who is awake. You can't call an Eved who is awake mishtameres. Why not? Because when the Eved is awake, he could what? He could do whatever he wants. To which the Gemara says, to which the Gemara says, Yoshenu mishamar ta'rezeget. So I don't understand. If the Eved is sleeping, and she's standing there, ultimately, again, that's called the chatzar mishtameres. Amai, chatzar ma'alechasi, the chatzar ma'aleches lo kana. We will say, this is a mobile chatzar. And in general, the concept that a mobile chatzar cannot acquire. V'chi tema yoshin shiny. Maybe you'll say that, well, one second, once he's sleeping, right? He's sleeping now. So now he could be a chatzar mishtameres, to which the Gemara answers, V'amarava kol she'ilu mahalech lo kana, Omid v'yoshev lo kana. So Rav Yosef said, Rava said, any chatzar that is technically mobile, even if now it's immobile, doesn't have the ability to acquire. To which the Gemara says, you're right. What's the case? The hilchos sabekafos. The halacha also would be in a case of an Eved who is bound. So if you have a tied up, bound Eved, Einach will say in that case, the Eved ultimately could act as a chatzar. Why? Because since he's bound, you've removed mobility. Once you've removed mobility, then ultimately he has the ability to function as a chatzar. Okay, I will say, bottom line, the takeaway from this particular sugya is that number one, I will say this case over here of halacha l'maisa, if he gives her the document, and ultimately she thinks she's taking a loan document, ultimately, again, he gives her the document, she takes it, she reads it as a get, it's only going to be good once he says, harei a get. Case number two, or introduced to Rabbi say is, there is a nesina, the definition of giving, of nesina is actively directing the get in her direction, even if at the end of the day she takes it. So meaning, if he, like that's the case also where the get is in his belt. Get is in his belt, he moves his hips towards her, she takes it, halacha l'maisa, as long as there is a directed movement from him to her, that is going to be called an nesina. He puts a get in her hand when she's asleep, and ultimately, again, she wakes up, she finds the get. Ultimately, again, that requires an amira of harei ze get. In other words, because also remember, essentially, he's given it to someone without das. So therefore, when she wakes up and realizes what it is, he has to say to her, harei zu gitech. Incredible. Mishnah. This so we'll say this is now an interesting sugya. So we'll say so we're transitioning now a little bit. We've gone from a case ultimately again from her chatzar to now imagine the following situation. Reuven and Rachel are standing in Rishus Harabim. They're standing in the public domain. What does Reuven do? He throws the get to Rachel. So I will say, so the shaila is now, what's the halacha? So hay some of this, Rishus Harabim, v'zarku la, and now he throws her a get. So also what's the halacha? Karav la migureshes, karav la in migureshes. If the get falls closer to her, she is divorced. If the get falls closer to him, she's not divorced. I mechza al mechza. We'll say what happens if it's half and half, equidistant to the two of them. The migureshes and migureshes, suffix migureshes. She's a suffix divorce. And we'll say, by the way, what happens in every case of suffix divorce? What happens in every case? Number one, you have to give another get. Number two, if he were to die without children, then what? Chalisa and no yibum. Okay, v'cheil inyan kiddushin. We'll say the same case applies to kiddushin. In other words, if Reuven wants to marry Rachel, he throws her kesef kiddushin. If the kesef kiddushin lands closer to her, she's mekudeshes. Closer to him, she's not mekudeshes. Mechza, equidistant, suffix. V'chein ve'inyan achov. Both say same thing applies to repaying a debt. Listen to this. Reuven lent Shimon money, right? Reuven's the creditor, Shimon's the borrower. Watch this. Amar lo bal chovo, zrok li chovi. So Reuven says to Shimon, throw me the money you owe me. V'zarku lo, and Shimon threw it. Karav l'malva zacha malva. If it lands closer to the lender acquired it. Karav l'lova halova chayv. Throw it lands closer to the lova's chayv. Now both say, Rashi points out over here, and what happens if you can imagine the following case? Shimon, the borrower, throws the money to Reuven. And we'll say what happens, the money lands, right after the money lands, what happens? A dog comes along, runs away with the money. So we'll say, so now the shaila is, who's on the hook? To which the Gemara says, if it's closer to the lender acquired the money and it's his loss. Closer to the borrower is in possession of the money and it's his loss. Mechza, what happens if it's equidistant between the two? Yachloku, they split the loss. So it says the Gemara, let's analyze. Hechi dami karavlo, vechi dami karavlo. What is this case? Because it sounds like a very strange case, right? Reuven and Rachel, husband and wife, are standing in Rosh Hashanah. It's a public domain. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Amarav, arba amos shelo, zeu karov lo. Arba amos shelo, zeu karov lo. Oh, Shavuot says, comes along Rav and says, let's clarify what we're talking about over here. We'll say, when a person is in Rosh Hashanah, remember, as much as it's public domain, a person does have their own space in Rosh Hashanah, right? What do we call that? That's your dalaramas. Right? Everybody has their dalaramas. So we'll say, so maybe Rav says, maybe what we're talking about over here is karov la. What does it mean? The get is landing close to her in her dalaramas, close to him in his dalaramas. To which the Gemara says, "Hey, I'm sorry." What's the case of mechza mechza? Amar Shlobar Yivisa Kigon Shahayu Shneim Omnim Ba'arba Amos. So I will say, what could be the case of mechza mechza? The case where they're both standing in the same dalar amos. I velech say him and I kadim. Just see who got there first. Also remember again, right? In other words, let's see who got there first, because whoever got there first is the one who owns those dalar amos. I maybe you'll say they got there at the same exact time. Obviously, you can't do that. Right? It is impossible to be that precise. Right? It's impossible for two people to arrive in the same place exactly at the same time. But there's a better interpretation. Rav Kana says, what are you talking about? Where Reuven and Rachel are standing exactly 8 amos away from each other. So essentially what's happening over here is they're Dalet amos, literally again, border on one another. Amud Beis, Beget Yotzei Arba Amos Shel Dalet Amos Shela. So we'll say, what's the case? Okay, so Bepashtos, what it means is, Karov Lo means it lands in her Dalet Amos. Karov Lo means it lands in his Dalet Amos. Ultimately, Moshe says the Gemara. Rabbi Gessim Arba Shlam va'ayva ha'agid gabe. But I will say, but interestingly enough, specifically I will say in the case of, so I will say, if you could imagine for just a moment, what's the case? The case could be aloha l'maisa, where the get straddles part of his dalar amos and part of her dalar amos. To which the Gemara says that's not going to work. Why is it not going to work? Because halacha l'maisa, if the get is straddling any part of his dalar amos, then what? It's in his rishos. And if it's still in his rishos, then that is a deficient nesina. That is a deficient act of conveyance. Ella, so the Gemara says, Ella Rabba of Rabbi Yosef, no, what's the case? Hacha was Aman Ayin Chesma Beis 78b, 3 lines down. Hacha b'shtei kiti edim askinon. I will say, what's the case? We're dealing with 2 groups of witnesses. Achas omeres karov lo, ba'achas omeres karov lo. So I'll say, interesting, this has nothing to do with geographically where the get lands, but rather, again, we have 2 sets of witnesses. Right? Everybody agrees Reuven threw a get to Rachel. What's the machlokes? Where did it land? One set of witnesses say it landed closer to Reuven. One set of witnesses say it landed closer to Rachel. So Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Karov Loshaninu Afilu Mea Ama. The Karov Loshan Afilu Mea Ama. So this is very interesting. Rabbi Yochanan comes along and says, now the common denominator in the first couple of interpretations is that they're all talking about where the get is falling somewhere in her dalet amos or his dalet amos, and that makes a lot of sense because Lamaisa, your dalet amos are koner for you even in Rishus Harabim. Right? Then Rabbi and Yosef are coming along and saying about testimony. Here Rabbi Yochanan says something very interesting. He says, when we speak about Karov Law, that is falling closer to Rabbi, it even means even within 100 amos of her. Rabbi say, now that's really interesting. Because now Rabbi say, what if you could imagine for just a moment, so what that sounds like it's saying is like this. Imagine for a second, Reuven and Rachel are standing at a good distance from one another. Right? What does Reuven do? Right? Reuven is a former, Heisman Trophy winner, right? So what does he do? He takes that get, right? He throws a perfect spiral, right? And it's landing, but imagine for a moment, right? They're standing, 200 feet away from each other. So now Rabbi Yosef is saying, by the way, even if that get lands 50 feet away from her, but it's closer to her than it is to him, she's migurashas. She's divorced. Which is it's hard for us to, remember, where are they standing? In Rosh Hashanah. So let's work this through. So the Gemara says, so again, Yochanan Karov La Shaninu Afilu Mea Ama. Karov Lo Shaninu Afilu Mea Ama. Hechidami. So we'll say, what's the case of Mechza Mechza? So it's Amar of Shman Bar Abba, Lididimi Farshli Minei Rabbi Yochanan. Hu Yachal L'Shomro, V'hi Einu Yachal L'Shomro, Zeu Karov Lo. Hi Yachal L'Shomro, V'hu Einu Yachal L'Shomro, Zeu Karov Lo. Shnei Yachal L'Shomro, Shnei Yachal L'Shomro, Zeu Mechza Mechza. So once that comes along, Rabbi Yochanan gives us a working definition now. Let's say, what does this mean? Let's analyze this. Karov Lo, or Karov, is a function of who has the ability to guard this document. Right? We'll say that's really what it means. It's not as much a function of is it within her dalar amas, not within her dalar amas. It's a very simple definition. If Reuven throws Rachel a get, if it lands close enough to her that if a dog were to come running after it, she could grab it up first. Or if the wind were to start to blow it away, she could grab it up first. That's called karov law. Now we'll say, now what is that? Is that 2 amas? Is it 3 amas? It's going to depend on every person, every day. But the idea over here is karov law means it's close enough to her that she could guard it. Karov lo is close enough to him that he could guard it, and she cannot. Mechza is close enough to both of them that they can guard it, or far enough from both of them that neither can guard it. Incredible. Shabbos say that's a working definition. That's a working definition. Amru Rabbana Kamid Rabbi Yochanan B'Shed Rabbi Yonasan. So the rabbis said this over in front of Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Yonasan. Hachi, so the Gemara says, sorry, Mshed Rabbi Yonasan. Hachi Amar Yadin Chavrin Bavloi Lifarusha Kiaitam. And he said, you know what? Those Babylonians, they know what they're talking about. In other words, it was a praise to Rabbi Yochanan. Ultimately, again, that Allah Chalamai said this is a good interpretation of this sugi. So I will say what this does is it removes us from specific geographic areas. In other words, so obviously, again, Dalet Amas is always going to work. But the Chiddush of Rabbi say is, even if the get falls outside of her Dalet Amas, but what? If Rabbi say, remember, what do you have going for you in this case? What do we have going for us in this case? Is there an asina in this case? Is there an asina? Is there an act of giving? Yes. Why? Because Reuven is throwing in the get to Rachel. Obviously, it's directed at act of giving. And as long as that get is close enough to her that she has the ability to guard it, should the dog try to come or something else, then again I will say that tells us that's in her shus. That's in her shus. Incredible. Says Gemara, Taina Rabbi says supports this. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Kol shu karov lo milo. Any case where the get falls closer to her than it is to him, uba kelev v'natlo, but if a dog were able to come and take it, Eina Migareshas. Ultimately, again, she's not divorced. Eina Migareshas, Kohechi Tintere V'Teisla. I understand she has to be able to guard the get forever. Ella Lav Hachi Kamar. Kol Shekarov La Milo, V'ilu Ba Kelev V'Not Lo, V'Hu Yachal L'Shomro, V'Ye'en Yachal L'Shomro, Eina Migareshas. So I will say again, so we just mentioned before, Halach L'Mais, what it comes down to is the get close enough to her that should something happen, right? Should the dog come to get it, she could snatch it up. That's called karov lo. If she can't snatch it up, that's called karov lo. Karov lo. Amar li Shmuel Rav Yehuda Shinina kedei shetashuach v'titleno. So we'll say, so Shmuel came out to Rav Yehuda and said, it's got to be close enough that what? She could bend down and go ahead and pick it up. Look at Rashi. Kedei shetashuach v'titleno. Had the havya kurva the masnisin v'afilu hachi. I supposed to listen to this. So now, also what you begin to see is we're kind of further defining it more and more and more. Obviously, I will say if it's falling in her Dalet Amas, that's going to work because your Dalet Amas and Rosh Hashanah, that is your domain. Came along Rabbi Yochanan says it's got to be close enough that she could guard it from something happening to it. Now, I will say comes along Shmuel, and Shmuel says it's got to be close enough for us to say that what? That she could bend down and grab it. Right? So what you begin to see is everybody's limiting the space a little bit more. It's got to be close enough to her that she could bend down and take it. Va'at lo tavid uvda adamati gita liada. So what it's very important. This is incredibly important, and this is actually codified in the Rabbim and Shulchan Aruch. So we'll say, at the end of the day, we're going to adopt this position of Shmuel. That karov law means it's close enough that she can immediately bend down and take it. Now we'll say, that's going to be our definition of karov law, and therefore karov law, same thing, it's close enough to him that he can bend down and take it. Now we'll say, I just want to point out, let's just play this out for just a second. Reuven and Rachel are standing in Shusarabim. Good. Reuven throws Rachel a get. They bless you. The get lands close enough to her, and Mamish close enough to her that she could bend down and get it. We'll say, what's the halacha? Valid, right? Migureshas. When is she migureshas? When? Right? Rosa, technically, right then and there. Right? Remember again, for her to be divorced doesn't require her to actually pick up the get. No different that when Reuben goes to her chutzner, throws the get into her chutzner. When is she divorced? As soon as the get hits her chutzner. Technically speaking over here, as soon as that get is in close enough proximity to her that she could bend down and take it, she's divorced. Shmuel says, while that is true, va'at lo savid uvda adamati gitli yada. Don't do anything until that get is actually in her hand. Now we'll say, now why? What is Shmuel concerned about? See, I will say, this case is a little bit trickier than previous cases. Because cases of karov lo or karov law, I will say, to the bystander, may not be totally observable. What Shmuel was concerned about was that if you allow her to essentially just be divorced right then and there, it could cause such a misunderstandings. People don't know what is karov law. They might see this and they might think to themselves, oh, that get is not karov law. It's not karov law. And they might come to think that what? That you could even get divorced even in a case of karov lo. So for Shmuel said, in these cases of karov law, she is not to be treated as a divorced woman until the get actually reaches her hand. So an extra chumrah on top of this. Quite fascinating. And the Gemara says it was an episode like this where the get landed. Rabbi says into this, the get landed karov law. So technically it was good. Before Rachel got a chance to pick it up, what happened? Reuven died without children, and they mandated chalitza in that case. Rabbi says she was technically divorced. If she was divorced, there's no chalitza. But because the get did not reach her hand, so Rabbi says, so this is how the Rambam paskins. So Rabbi said the definition of karov law is the get is close enough to her that she could just bend down and pick it up. But the halacha says, do not treat her as a divorced woman until when? Until ultimately, again, the get actually reaches her hands. Incredible. The Chaya in Kiddushin. The Bible said the same concept applies to Kiddushin. In other words, if Reuben wants to marry Rachel, he throws kesef Kiddushin at her. Right? I don't know that she should go through with the shidduch, right? But right? But again, if it's karov law, she's mikudeshes. Karov lo, not mikudeshes. Amrav the Gittin amru v'lo davra acher. Rabbi said in Rabbi Yochanan, no, this concept of karov lo and karov law only applies to Gittin and nothing else. But the Mishnah didn't say it. The Mishnah said this whole thing of karov lo works for Kiddushin also. Shiny hasam d'chsiv yatzav haisa. No. Kiddushin is different. You're right. Everyone agrees it works for Kiddushin. Why? I will say, by definition, there is a direct correlation between Gittin and Kiddushin. What's the direct correlation between Gittin and Kiddushin? They're two sides of the same coin, right? Two sides of the same coin. So therefore, again, whatever, and the pasuk itself juxtaposes, right? It says the yatsa mi beis. So it talks about divorce, right? One man will divorce his wife. She can marry someone else. So the biblical juxtaposition of Gittin and Kiddushin tells us whatever applies to one will apply to the other. So that's understood. The chayla inyan achov. I will say the truth is the same. So we'll say fine. So this whole idea of karov lo will only apply to Gittin and Kiddushin, nothing else, really. But yeah, we'll say we learned the same applies also to a debt. What was the debt case? Zrok lichovi, right? Reuven lends Shimon money, and then Reuven says to Shimon, pay me back, throw me back my money. V'zarko lo, and Shimon threw it back. Karov lamalva zacha halova. If it lands closer to the lender, then again, the borrower is in luck, right? Because now his debt is repaid, even if something happens to the money. Karov lalova halova chayiv. If it lands closer to the lender, as we just said in the Mishnah, the lender is chayiv. Mechsal mechsa shneim yachloku. If it's equidistant, they both share responsibility. So also you see that karov lo works by debts as well. Hachamayaskinon the amarle zrok li chovi viti pater. But ultimately, again, he said, all right, we'll see. What we're going to do. We'll stop over here for today. Again, we'll just end. We'll pick up again with the chov case. But again, here's what we know: the concept of karov lo will work by Gittin. It was introduced by Gittin. Once it works by Gittin, it will apply to Kiddushin. Does it actually halachically apply to the case of repaying a debt? Emirat Hashem to be continued tomorrow. Shkoyach.